Hello, and welcome back to part two of the Shroud of Turin. This again with Brian Janeway, Dr. Brian Janeway, I should say. Thank you for joining us again, Brian, and walking us through the Sudarium of Oviedo. I'm really excited to listen to this, and I'm just going to hand it off to you. Take it away.
Very good. Thank you, Zach. I'm happy you didn't forget the doctor part. I get really offended when people don't use my proper title.
I mean, I figure you earned it. I might as well address it, right?
No, actually, I'm just pretending. I don't. That's no big deal at all. So this Sudarium of Oviedo, the last time we spoke was about, of course, the Shroud of Turin, which most people have heard of, and I had heard of decades ago when I started paying attention to things like this. But this other artifact called the Sudarium of Oviedo, I had never heard of until I started researching on the Shroud. And then there were these references to this Sudarium, and it's kind of a strange word, but I started looking into it, and turns out it kind of ties into the whole Shroud, and that's why I've included it in what are now three parts, where I broke the Shroud into two parts: the story of the Shroud and the science of the Shroud. And then this third part, the Sudarium of Oviedo, because it correlates in many ways to the Shroud of Turin, but it has an entirely different history, which is interesting and fascinating, and also has been subjected to scientific study and analysis for a couple of decades now. It was not really brought to the forefront until a little bit in I think the 70s, and then into the 90s when they first started, they formed a scientific committee, a group of scholars to study this more in depth and systematically. So we'll move into what you're seeing here on the title slide is the Shroud on the left and the Sudarium on the right. As you can see, they're not at all alike, at least not that I can show you yet, but you'll see there are some similarities. But just a brief overview of the Shroud of Turin, I thought, would be appropriate for those who, even if you had seen part one, it'll be familiar and it'll be a repeat, which always helps to ground in those ideas and those facts. But also, if they hadn't seen the Shroud part, then they'll get a quick little overview here, which will help to introduce the Sudarium as well. So the way I like to start out the Shroud of Turin talk is to say that there are literally thousands of books and articles and documentaries that have been done about the Shroud of Turin over many, many years. And here's just a flash of a few. That this one by Ian Wilson, by the way, is a very excellent overview of everything to do with the Shroud by Ian Wilson, who's probably the main, I would say, historian that deals with the Shroud. And he's brought together all the evidence together in this book. And he's particularly good at tracing the history of the Shroud and making the connection between an earlier artifact known as the Image of Edessa, which we spoke about, and the Shroud of Turin, because there's a discontinuity. There's a missing century and a half between those two. So connecting those two is important to make the tracing of the Shroud history all the way back to potentially the first century AD. So some of the other books here, Shroud Conspiracy, because this is such an amazing object, it's lent itself to all kinds of different conspiracy theories and wild ideas. But as you can see, it's always been a very famous artifact. And I should say, in the terms of the Catholic theology, it's a holy relic. So like the Sudarium, it's been venerated for many centuries, along with many other types of objects. I'm going to touch a little bit on that in this presentation related to the Sudarium. So two of the best resources you could find on this particular relic is called Sacred Blood, Sacred Image, the Sudarium of Oviedo by Janice Bennett. And this one by Mark Guskin, who is a historian who's dealt with all of the ancient sources that mention the Sudarium and also the Image of Edessa. He's done some great work on the Image of Edessa and the history of that object. And that's Mark Guskin. So these are two great books if you want to start delving into this on your own. So here's a picture of the Sudarium of Oviedo. And as you can see, it's just a stained cloth. It's got blood stains in it, and there's a certain pattern of them here. It's called the Sudarium for reasons I'll go into in a moment. It's called, from Oviedo because it's kept now in a cathedral, in a reliquary in the cathedral there in Oviedo, Spain, which is in northwest Spain in the area called Asturias, which it so happens, and this ties into the history of the Sudarium, was the only part of Spain that was never conquered by the Muslim invasion, which had begun in 711 and wasn't finally pushed out until the time of Christopher Columbus, some 500 years later. No, I'm sorry, it would be about 600 years later in 1492 or thereabouts. So you have here the Shroud of Turin. It's 14 feet long, about 3.5 feet wide. And just to give you a sense of scale, the Sudarium of Oviedo is only 34 inches by 21 inches, and it would be about this size when you compare it to the Shroud. Now, just a short description of the Sudarium. It's always been known as the Sudarium Domini, or the Sudarium of the Lord. Now, one of the aspects about this, it has no artistic value. So that's one argument in favor of its authenticity. Why would someone keep a bloody cloth? Other than that it had a particular significance as to whose blood was on it. Because to display something like this doesn't have any value other than what it's reported to have been stained by. So 34 by 21 inches, it's made of woven taffeta linen, which I'm told is common in wedding garments, like wedding dresses, and in drapes and things. So it's a particular kind of weave. It bears the blood stains on it, but no image is on the Sudarium. So that's different from the Shroud in that. It's kept in the Reliquary at the Cathedral of Oviedo, Spain, and it's only brought out on display 3 times a year, on September 14th, September 21st, and on Good Friday. And I got the question the first time I presented this, well, why are those dates? So I had to go back and check. So for those of you who are interested, September 14th is the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. And that actually marks a very historically significant date where the Byzantine emperor, whose name was Heraclius, who's one of the great Byzantine emperors of the 7th century, had brought back the reputed to be the true cross. Now, if we go back to the 4th century, we have the mother of Constantine the Great, the first Christian Roman emperor that we now call Byzantine, or the Byzantine emperor. His mother probably had a hand in his conversion. She was a Christian, and her name was Helena, Queen Helena. And she went on what you might say is the first pilgrimage to the Holy Land to locate sites that were of significance to the events of the New Testament. And one of those places she marked out was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we'll take a closer look at today. But she also claims to have found the true cross, the actual cross that Christ was crucified on, and that became a holy relic. But then when the Persians invaded a couple of hundred years later, they took this cross back to their capital in Persia. And then subsequent to that, Heraclius then reclaimed it when he defeated the Persians, and he brought it back to Jerusalem. And that was in 627. And the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross is the date that marks the reclaiming of the true cross back to Jerusalem. September 21st is the Feast of St. Matthew, and of course, Good Friday being the 3rd date. Now, this is the cathedral in Oviedo as it appears today. It's quite ancient itself. It goes back to the 8th century, and it was founded by a king by the name of Frela I. He was the king of Asturias. Now, in this cathedral is what they call the Holy Chamber, where they keep all of their great stuff, all of their holy relics. In particular, the chest, which you see in the foreground here at the bottom, is called the Holy Ark. And that was built in the 8th century by Alfonso II. All right. So here's a close-up of the Holy Ark, and it has beautiful silver embossed relief work all around the chest. Now, it's an oaken chest. So it was later added in, I believe, the 12th century it is here, the silver gilding, which shows all the apostles and Jesus in the middle. But the original oaken chest, I've not determined whether they've actually done any radiocarbon dating on this, which could be extremely significant. But this oaken chest is what history has told us, and that the relics, which included the Sudarium, were brought to Spain from Jerusalem. But that's how it appears today. It was King Alfonso VI that commissioned the decoration of the Holy Chamber and the silver embossed cover for the chest, and that is dated to 1113 with a Latin inscription which reads, "Of the sepulchre of the Lord," that is the tomb or the coffin of the Lord, "and of his Sudarium and of his holy, most holy blood." Now, in this ark, or this holy chest, There are contents listed from a 1465 inventory, which include an amazing number of artifacts. Now, I'll leave it to you whether these are authentic or not. And to my knowledge and to my reading, there's been no real research done on these other objects to determine their authenticity, unlike the Sudarium. So we have a piece of the true cross, a piece of the stone from Jesus' sepulcher, some of his clothes from the manger, several thorns from his helmet of thorns, one of the 6 jugs in which he turned water into wine, the forehead of John the Baptist and some of his hair, and the hands of St. Stephen, also the sandal of St. Peter, and many, many more. So it's thought that all of these things, and later, and they're not all first century relics, were a sort of a compilation over some period of time that were added to this collection that are in the Holy Ark today. So this shows the Sudarium as it's brought out on display on those 3 days of the year, this one being in 1999. Now there is, as I mentioned, a group of scholars that were commissioned to undertake analysis of various kinds of this cloth. It's called the Spanish Cinder of Sindonology. Sindon is one of the words used in the Synoptic Gospels to describe the linen that we consider to be the Shroud of Turin, or I should say to those who think the shroud is authentic, the burial cloth of Jesus is called the Sindon, and that's in the Synoptic Gospels. And then there's this investigative team in particular called the Team of the Spanish Center of Sindonology, which began in 1989 to study this cloth in more depth. Now, to retrace the history of this cloth, we look at this big map, and it shows Jerusalem in the lower right corner. And then, according to sources that I'll cite shortly, it fled the impending invasion of the Persians, and it fled to Alexandria in Egypt. But 2 years later, this city was conquered, so it continued to flee, and by boat went to Spain, into Cartagena, and then from there to Sevilla, to Toledo, and Oviedo, where it sits today, or where it's kept today. So here's a little better map of Spain: Cartagena, Sevilla, Toledo, and this is where various bishops were located. How it went originally to Cartagena is unknown. That would be interesting to know exactly why they ended up going to Cartagena, but this ended up being almost fortuitous, because the Muslim invasions of the Arabs, which came later after the Persians, they swept across North Africa and eventually even to Morocco. And in 711, the Moroccan Arabs, at that time, the Muslims, jumped across at Gibraltar and began an invasion of Spain, which lasted for several years. They didn't meet a whole lot of resistance, and they eventually took over all of Spain except for this area of Oviedo and Asturias up in the northwest of Spain. So once that invasion had started, that's when it started to take its course up to the north to Oviedo, along with refugees apparently that were fleeing the invasion. So to go back to the beginning, we look at this term Sudarian in the Greek, or Sudarium in the Latin. And it comes from the Latin word sudor, to sweat. And there are 4 times that it occurs in the New Testament. The first one is in Luke. It says, and this is the case of, it comes where he's teaching a parable, and it says, another came saying, Master, here is your mina, which is like a coin, which I kept put away in a handkerchief. For I was afraid of you, because you are an exacting man. You take up what you did not lay down and reap what you did not sow. So it appears to be something like a billfold or a small purse that coins could be kept in and then stuck in your pocket. The second time is when the story of Lazarus is told. And it goes, when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, saying, Lazarus, come forth. The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. That was the term used, Sudarium. The third one comes in John in chapter 20, and this is the one that I often refer to with the Shroud of Turin, because it gives a more detailed and complete description of what they found in the empty tomb. And it says, so Simon Peter also came, following him and entering the tomb, and he saw the linen wrappings. That word in the Greek is othonia, which is plural for linens, which we talked about in the Shroud talk. They were lying there, and the face cloth, the Sudarium, which had been put on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. So it was separate, and we also learned that it was used to cover his face. And there's a fourth instance of this term used, and in the description of miracles done in Ephesus by Paul, it says God was performing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that handkerchiefs or aprons that had touched him, that is Paul, were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and the evil spirits left them. Now, the translations differ. This is according to the new, I actually did a combination here between NASB and NIV to get some of the terminology more clear. But apparently Paul was using some kind of a handkerchief or a small cloth to do healings with. So those are the 4 times we look at Sudarium in the New Testament. So it's used as a handkerchief, like a wallet. It's used as a burial cloth for Lazarus. It's found in the empty tomb, which was used on the face of Jesus. And finally, as a sort of a cloth to do healings with by Paul. So here's a schematic showing how this Shroud of Turin was wrapped around the body of Jesus lengthwise. So you might think, well, like a mummy, it would be wrapped around horizontally, but no, it was laid out flat. The body was put on it. Now, if, of course, I'm assuming here that it is Jesus, but that's not totally proven. But the man on the shroud, if we can call him that, the shroud was laid out flat, the body put on top, and then it was laid and brought back over him lengthwise. That shows, of course, the front and back full images of a man apparently crucified. So we look at some of the early historical sources regarding the Sudarium, and there's a man named Nanus of Panopolis, which is in Egypt. This is from the 5th century, and it's a paraphrase of John's Gospel. And I won't read this all out, but the 2 things that come apparent here that we learn, if this is authentic, but we have no idea, but of how accurate it is, and whether it does appear to be referring to the Sudarium, but it makes reference to that it covered his head, and that there was a knot toward the upper back of the part that covered the hair. Now, that's a detail we didn't get from the gospel accounts, but that comes in as we look at the Sudarium. So apparently it was used for containing the flow of blood and fluids, and it was Jewish custom to cover the face of the dead if there was any particular gruesome or macabre signs of death and torture or trauma. So out of respect for the dead, it was customary to wrap the face in some kind of a cloth. And also the function of it being to contain the flow of fluids and blood. So the knot that he makes reference to here is, we'll come back to here in a minute. Another early source says this was from an anonymous Italian pilgrim from the 6th century. His pilgrimage to the Holy Land, he mentions that 7 nuns in 7 cells close to the monastery of St. Mark on the east side of the Jordan, that would be in the country of Jordan today, they looked after the Sudarium of Christ. Now, the 7 nuns in 7 cells sounds a little suspicious because that's a symbolically important number in the Bible. There's the life of Santo Nino of Georgia. That's up in what used to be the Soviet Union, close to Russia, in the 4th century, records that Peter had hidden it in an unknown location, the Sudarium. And then we have a man by the name of Isodod of Murd in Turkmenistan, modern Turkmenistan, says the burial linens were given to Joseph of Arimathea, but Simon Peter took the Sudarium and used it like a crown on his head for healings, such as used today by bishops as turbans or like a forerunner to the mitre. So this is a little bit hard to imagine because it's not really large enough to wrap around the head like a turban. And to imagine Paul taking this bloody cloth and then wrapping it around his head like it was some kind of a ceremonial cap seems a little unlikely. So there's some skepticism regarding that. Other medieval sources from the Bishop of Pelayo. Now this comes to Spain. He's from the 12th century. He was an historian and a bishop, and he wrote histories of the early kings of Asturias, covering a period from about 986 to 1109. He records that the cloth was taken from Jerusalem in advance of the Persian invasion under Khosroes II. This is in 614 AD. So it fled first to Alexandria, but then that fell by 616. Remember, I mentioned that during the map. And then it made its way to Cartagena, Spain, along with other refugees that were fleeing the Persian invasion. And it was at that time, as mentioned, as being included in that oaken chest of relics that traveled by sea. And then we have St. Leandro, Bishop of Sevilla, who took the oaken relic chest to Sevilla, where it was kept until 657. Now, this is, remember, prior to the Arab invasion of Spain. So it was making its way into other parts of Spain, but not yet threatened by another invasion. And then we have St. Isidore, his successor, who took it to Toledo until 718, when it fled the Muslim invasion of 711 and following, up to a place called Mont Sacros, like the sacred mountain, which is near Oviedo. So from 718 until it was brought to the cathedral, it was kept in this small chapel up on the mountain of Our Lady of Monsacro. So it's very obscure. It's kind of removed. And from what I understand, it's hard even, it's not an easy hike even up to the site. So you can see cows and stuff grazing around it. Of course, these are very recent pictures. But you can see in the lower right-hand picture another sort of chamber. This is where it was probably kept during those years. And then we have a couple of other very interesting mentions, which I think are worth highlighting. Bishop Ponce in AD 1030 records that there was a chest of relics that had been in the Church of San Salvador for centuries, but by this time, no one even knew what its contents were. So imagine this had already been there for 3 centuries, but there's almost no mention of it ever having been put on display or any inventory taken of the holy chest. So it was kept very quiet, and presumably there's a reason, because it was still during the Muslim occupation of Spain. So they probably wouldn't want to bring this out and start parading it around for fear that the Muslims might want to come up and take it or destroy it. So it was sort of in hiding, and it sort of goes in disappearance, but he didn't know what else was in the chest. And then at one point, he assembles some dignitaries, relatives, friends, to open up the case. And what he records is when the moment the reliquary lid was cracked open, a cutting and blinding whiteness escaped and frightened the people, and it blinded some of the people permanently, which is pretty amazing. And this brings to light, and I wish I had, let me take that out, the video I tried to put on my little PowerPoint here, but it played the first time, but it didn't have audio. So maybe Zach, you can help me out with some of these technical aspects. But I took a scene from, does this bring any particular movie to mind, Zach? They open up an ark and this blinding white light comes out and creates all kinds of chaos. This is from the Indiana Jones. Where they open up that ark, and remember all those, and I watched the scene recently, all these Nazis who have captured it, it opens up and this white light comes out and it starts blasting all these different Nazis. And Indiana Jones and his romantic interest, I forget her name in the movie, but they're tied up there, sort of being held hostage. And he screams out, "Don't open your eyes! Don't look at it!" So they're holding their eyes shut while this light comes out and blasts all the different Nazis and stuff when they open up the ark. So maybe they got that idea. I'd have to go back and check for that movie scene from this particular historical recollection. Then in 1075, we have King Alfonso VI. He officially opens the chest in the presence of a man named Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. And I would ask, Zach, have you ever heard of this individual? If you said yes, I'd be extremely surprised.
No, I'm not that impressive. So no.
Unless you're really into Spanish history and you would know this, you wouldn't know. But you would know him if you've watched movies. He was El Cid, most famous for conquering the Muslim kingdom of Valencia in 1099. Of course, we all know El Cid as no one else but Charlton Heston, of course. And his interest in that movie was no one other than Sophia Loren. So he plays El Cid. So El Cid was in the presence of the Sudarium when it was brought up. Oh, look at this. It actually played this time. But the audio, I think, is not working. This is about a 2.5-minute clip, but I'll just show a part of this. Okay, so here's Indiana Jones saying, "Don't look, close your eyes." So they open it up and all these light tubes are coming out, and they actually start taking the image of ghosts and individuals. Now, this is the man who, of course, competed with Indiana Jones to get the Ark, and now he appears to have won, and then he opens it up, and he's transfixed by what he's looking into on the Ark. But at first, these light symbols seem to be flashes are harmless, but then they start doing some serious damage to the individuals assembled. Here it takes on a ghostly sort of a skeleton figure, and the sound here is great. This guy screams like a little girl at this point, and then The guy who's standing over the ark is looking down. Oh, it's beautiful. There he is. He's just absolutely transfixed by what he's looking into. But then it consumes him too. So I'll move on from that. So now we go to more of the analysis and the science of this Sudarium. And what they were able to do was to try to recreate the stain pattern of this cloth. And so they rigged up a model human head with tubes and containers of fluids to simulate the staining of blood and pleural edema, other fluids that came out post-mortem. And so what they found was, and what appears to be the case in the sequence of events in which these linens were used, was when the body was still on the cross but dead, someone put the Sudarium around the head. And then at some point, about an hour later, the body was brought down off of the cross and sat on an upside down horizontal position. I'll get into some more details in a minute. And then possibly about an hour later or so, and it was thought that this is when they possibly obtained permission to take the body and take it to the tomb. It was wrapped in a temporary sort of transport shroud, because there's an historical mention of a shroud that was kept in Paris until the French Revolution, and then that was destroyed. But it could have been the temporary, and remember that term othonia for plural for linen, so there may have been more than one. There were. In addition to the shroud, there may have been other objects, like, for example, a transport shroud, a temporary shroud to bring the body from the area of the cross into the tomb. And then that one tossed aside. And then the really nice shroud, which is a very nice cloth, was laid out. Also, there may have been a strip that was wrapped around the head to hold the mouth shut. So that would be Athonia. So it was wrapped up here, taken to the tomb. And then to look at the Sudarium in detail, now we look here in the upper right-hand corner of the actual Sudarium, and you have a bunch of these wrinkles or folds. And this is a mock-up here on the right. This would have probably been where the knot was formed. So we still have evidence of the knot that was tied to fix the Sudarium on the head of the victim. And now we look at some of the specific stain patterns of the Sudarium. And we find that it was folded along an axis. So the reconstruction here is that while still hanging on the cross, and the head was determined to be declined at a 70-degree angle. So it was down like this. So imagine the vertical being the horizontal would be at 90 degrees. So down to 70 degrees, the head was leaned forward, and then 20 degrees to the right. So when they started, they attached the Sudarium to the back of the head with pins that were probably thorns, based on the punctures in the cloth are conical. They're not uniform, indicating like a needle. And it was wrapped around the back of the head, and then the front of the head in the face. And then it met some resistance or a barrier where they couldn't bring it all the way around to wrap. So they had to double it back over. And so you have a repeating parallel stain on a second layer of the cloth that was brought about the front side of the face again. So it's thought that the head was down and to the right to the degree that it was sort of up against the shoulder, so that when the hands would have been, or the arm would have been like this. So then it was brought around. They couldn't bring it all the way around, so they doubled it back over. So this formed the principal stain on the cloth here, and then they've divided an axis where it was folded back over itself. So this was in contact with the face itself. This stain was formed. And you can see it's a pretty extensive stain. And it includes more dense appearance here around the nose and the mouth. Now, on the left reverse side, the reverse side is considered the side that was in contact with the face. You have forehead stains, which are up here on the upper part of that. And then there's a trapezoidal shaped stain right down here where the red lines are indicated. And that's the dense area around the nose and the mouth. And then there are actual finger indications that fingers were used to contain the flow of fluid from the nose and the mouth after the body had been brought down. And those are indicative of two different positions of a hand that was applied to the cloth over the face after the body was brought down. I'll show you more on that in a minute. So the stains were determined to have been produced with a head tilted 70 down and 20 right. So here on the left, you see the stain formed initially by this angle, with the body in the vertical position. And then the second, when they brought the body down off of the cross, it was apparently laid out horizontally, face down, for a period of time approaching an hour. And this is when a second number of stains were formed. This is where the forehead stain was formed, and they determined that it was beyond the horizontal, actually at 115 degrees. So it was just slightly beyond horizontal to form a second set of stains. And this is when the fluid on the forehead, which is pulmonary fluid, was formed. So this is now post-mortem blood. This shows you an approximation of the position on the cross with the head and forming the obstruction on the right shoulder. Now this shows the various positions of the body when the cloth and the different stains were formed. So initially you have the front view here, and also it appears they have a strip here to recreate it. That's the strip that would have held the mouth shut after death. And in the back view of the Sudarium, and you'll see all these little black marks indicate stains of the blood, which we'll look at in a minute. And then the front view here, once the knot was tied, and then the third position shows after it was tossed aside, taken off the head, and with the knot still intact, probably tossed over to the side from the other linens as the third position. Now the trapezoidal stain, they were able to determine that it was applied with the thumb and the index finger, when initially it was in this position, so it was sort of upright, someone containing more fluids coming out. And then a second time, possibly when the body was being carried along from an upside down position, also they even determined it was a left hand, and then a finger-shaped stains were formed by the same left hand, but in an inverted position in this second photograph. Now, this is from a book called Beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which sort of summarizes a lot of the excavations that have been done over the years below and around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is the traditional spot of the crucifixion and tomb of Christ. We talked about this in more depth, I believe, during the Shroud talk, and I do believe myself that this is the authentic site. There's a competing site known as Gordon's Calvary, or the Garden Tomb. But this tomb has actual rock-cut tombs that are from the Old Testament period, as determined by experts, and also shows tool marks and cuttings from tools that were contemporary with hundreds of years before the time of Christ. So that, even though it's a beautiful place to have a church service, I've been there myself. I think it's the Anglican Church which has the site, and it's a wonderful place to contemplate Jesus and his tomb, because their tombs are laid out right behind and in the midst of where the outdoor church is held. But it's probably not authentic. In fact, Gordon's Calvary, and the history of that being the actual site, only goes back about 150 years. Now, this site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, has a history that goes back to the 4th century, the time of Constantine. And when they were able to open up the holy bed just last year, for the first time in over 300 years, they were doing some renovations of the church, and the edicule, the little house that's underneath the Great Dome, and which houses what's left of the native stone reputed to be that of Christ. They opened up the cover, and they were able to take samples of plaster and to do some isotopic dating of those various plaster fragments, and they were able to determine that the earliest fragment was from the early 4th century, which is exactly the time that Constantine, or I should say his mother, located the site in which the first church was built on the site, and which beforehand there had been a pagan temple built by Hadrian, the Roman emperor, in about 135, which was a temple to Aphrodite. And according to Eusebius, was built there in order to erase the memory and the place of the crucifixion and tomb of Christ himself. So that's what Eusebius writes. And so he's writing in the early 4th century. And at that time, the pagan temple had been there for 200 years. And so Constantine then undertook to raise the pagan temple, and then to put the first church at the church, now known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So this particular slide shows evidence of what was known to be a quarry in the 1st century, and also a number of 1st century tombs have been located underneath and around the area of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So that gives a good historical grounding. And now I marked this out because it shows the actual distance from Golgotha, where the crucifixion took place, to the tomb, the traditional spot of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Holy Bed. And that distance is about 40 to 45 meters in a northwesterly direction, as indicated by the arrow. So you can imagine that wouldn't have been a hole, that would have been about 120, 130 feet, and would have been easily walked with. You can imagine several people holding a body. It might take you 5 or 10 minutes to go that distance. So that's what they estimate was the time it would have taken to take that body. Now, this is the whole Sudarium with all of its various stains, and I'll explain a couple of these. We have the central principal stains here. So on the left side would have been directly touching the face. Let's start from the left side, and it shows stains from puncture wounds. So those are those little black dots that I mentioned in the earlier slide. So these are spots of blood on the back of the head, which were living blood. So those were shed when the victim was still alive, as opposed to some of these subsequent stains. There's also this butterfly wings shaped stain, which I'll show you. It was on the nape of the neck, and then on a model face, I'll show you where that was located. And then there's another corner stain, which also shows up and is depicted on the model I'll show you in a minute. Then you have the central stains here, and then, of course, the axis along the center, and then a repeat of the same pattern of staining over on the right side. You have the diagonal folds up here on the upper right, and then a large accordion-shaped stain on the right side. And those are thought to have, those are on the outer layers, and it's a thinner sort of liquid. It's like pleural edema fluid, which is about 7 parts fluid to 1 part blood. And that's indicative of post-mortem blood. Remember, on the Shroud of Turin, we had also post-mortem blood. In particular, the most notable example of that was from the spear wound in the chest, which had a large central core and then more fluid boundary area around it, which was indicative of a post-mortem wound where the blood had already started to separate, and that fluid built up in the lungs from the trauma of the whole flogging and crucifixion and beating had accumulated in the lungs. Okay, so here's a model head which shows some of those stain patterns from puncture wounds in the hair on the back of the neck, and then blood which would probably have issued from those wounds and had accumulated on the nape of the neck and down here a little bit lower on the upper shoulder. And then on the front side, you have this forehead stain, which, remember, was formed when the body was probably already brought down off the cross and put in a horizontal position. There was more blood outflow and fluids, which formed that part of the stain. And remember, this was all recreated by this model head, which they used to try to figure out exactly what these stains, how they were formed. And of course, the more dense section of stain around the nose and the mouth. Now, this shows sort of a transposition of the blood staining on the Sudarium over an image of the Shroud of Turin face. So what you have is not an exact correspondence, but many correspondences. So think of the sequence here. This cloth was fixed to the face after death, and it had 2 or probably 3 different incidences of staining. And then the body was brought in probably a temporary shroud, not the Shroud of Turin, to the tomb, and then that shroud was taken off, and then the Sudarium was taken off, and then the Shroud of Turin was brought in and would contain stains not exactly in correspondence, but in many cases they do. And according to the scholar who did an overlay technique, found dozens of points of correspondence between the staining on the 2 objects, both on the front side of the face and on the back. So that's what you're looking at here, is these white areas on the left are stains on the Shroud of Turin. And then on the right, you have on the light brown colors are all the stains on the Sudarium. So they do correspond in many ways, but you can expect that the Sudarium would have a lot more blood and fluids on it. And those would have been soaked up by this cloth. And then once that was taken off, you would have what was left on the body itself after 2 to 3 hours of events of being taken off the cross and such. So to move on, this particular model of the head is taken by a professor of sculpture from Spain, the University of Sevilla, who created a model face based upon the Shroud of Turin and then transposed on it the bloody stains from the Sudarium. You can see the forehead stain here and the dense stain around the mouth, and the beard as well going down into here. So that's an interesting and rather gruesome sight. So you have two kinds of blood. I've already kind of talked about this already. You have the pulmonary edema, and then you have living blood from parts like on the crown of thorns, probably created from the puncture wounds, which were all over the head. So you have living blood in the hair, both front and back on the shroud, but on the Sudarium, primarily located on the back. And interestingly, one commonality between the two objects is that they have the same blood type. I don't know if you remember from the shroud talk, but the blood type is AB blood type. And that is very common amongst Middle Eastern peoples, but much less so in others. It makes up about 5% of the human population. So fairly rare in the human population, but much more common in the Middle East. So same type of blood pattern on the Sudarium. Here's some other commonalities. I talked about the overlay technique. It showed 70 points of correspondence on the front and 50, I believe, on the back here. 70. Yeah, I didn't put that part on my slide, but that's what his study showed. Both linens have the same blood type, AB blood type. The nose can be measured on both objects, and it measures to be about 3 inches or 8 centimeters, with the nasal area of both containing a high amount of dirt and dust. And also we have evidence that the nose itself is swollen in the middle and on the right side and displaced to the right, possibly due to falling and might have had broken nose at that point, because the victim's hands would have been tied to the crossbeam. And so as you're walking along, if you were to trip, if you fell, you wouldn't be able to catch yourself. So you would do a face plant on the ground, which wouldn't be too pleasant, but might lead to a dislocation or breaking of the nose. That crossbeam was called a patibulum. The right cheek is not represented on either cloth due to a contusion visible in this area, while also completely bloody on both cloths. Also, the bloodstains on the back of both linens correspond, which I showed you on the slide, found on 2 right and lower left corners of the Sudarium. Now, we talk about Jewish law. So was the body of Jesus cleaned in according to Jewish ritual after death, or was it not? Now, according to Jewish law here, it was essential that Jesus was buried, or any victim of being hung on a tree or crucified had to be brought down before sunset. And then we go back to Deuteronomy for a key verse here. It says, if a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is accursed of God, so that you do not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, from Deuteronomy. And in Matthew, we read that when the evening had already come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea came, a prominent member of the council, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God, and he gathered up courage and went in before Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Now, the bloodstains on the shroud indicate that the body was not washed, and that was in compliance with Jewish law, because there were several conditions here. The person was a victim of a violent death, and or blood flowed during his lifetime, and it continued to flow at the time of death. He was not to be washed. A second condition was, and any one of these would have disqualified a corpse from being washed. The deceased received a capital punishment for a crime of a religious nature. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Number 3, the individual was an outcast from the Jewish community. You could argue that that was probably the case too with Jesus. And also the deceased was murdered by a non-Jew. Now, Jesus would have fulfilled all 4 of these, actually, but any one of these would have disqualified him from being ritually washed. Now, this goes back to the idea, now, why would they not wash a body of the blood? Now, the blood was, of course, considered sacred, and it contains sort of the essence of life in Jewish religion. So it was important to be kept from the individual. So if he were subjected to all this, to wash all that blood away would be to sort of wash away the essence of that person. So it was kept on the deceased if they had been subjected to these various things. If not, then he would be ritually cleaned and then put in the tomb. So this is why, and there are several indications here from the Sudarium that the blood and the keeping of that was important. The fact that you would wrap the head up to contain all the fluids that came out, including the blood. Also, the attempt to contain it with the finger marks indicate an attempt to contain that flow of blood. And also, they found evidence of aloes and myrrh in pollens on the Sudarium. We talked about that evidence from the Shroud of Turin, which has been established. So aloes and myrrh were an ancient way of preserving preservation of blood, but also to suppress the aroma that came with death. So the evidence they find on the Sudarium was that the evidence of aloes and myrrh were most intense in the areas of the blood stains and had been applied when the blood was still wet on the cloth, and there was a fixing of the aloes and myrrh of these substances to the blood spots. So it appears that when the Sudarium was taken off of the head, in the bloody areas, they actually put aloes and myrrh to preserve that blood on the cloth itself. And we have evidence of it here in the Sudarium. The Sudarium also likely dates based on this evidence of what's called, we've called a Z-twist. So it's there's a defect of crossing parallel lines and adjacent threads that's also found, like it is in the Sudarium, on Danish cloths that were produced on vertical looms with weights that are found between the years of approximately 400 BC and 500 AD. Incidentally, the Shroud of Turin also uses a Z-twist. So here you have an S-twist and a Z-twist shown. Here's evidence of aloes and myrrhs found. I'd like to see some stronger evidence of these because the first research we talked about with the Shroud of Turin, which was initially done in the 1970s, some of that was found to be not quite true. Now, there were evidences from the pollens, but the claims of the initial researcher, who was a Swiss forensic scientist, was that the pollens found on the shroud could only be found and localized to within a few miles of Jerusalem, which is pretty amazing evidence, but has later been shown to not be that localized. So the pollens, which are undoubtedly on the shroud, can't be localized that precisely. They're much more widespread to the Mediterranean region itself. So they found evidence of aloes and myrrh here also on the Sudarium, but there needs to be further research done. And this lower statement repeats what I talked about just a minute ago, where the concentrated areas of aloes and myrrh were actually on the bloodstains themselves before the blood itself had dried. Now we have another form of research done here. This is by Ray Rogers. Now Ray Rogers was the lead chemist on the original STIRP team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project team, the American team that went over to Turin in 1978 and undertook the first in-depth analysis using all of the scientific methods and equipment they could bring to bear on the Shroud of Turin. And they had 5 days to perform any and all tests they wanted to, as long as they didn't damage the shroud. Now, Ray Rogers was on that original team of the Shroud of Turin. Excuse me. And he did some testing subsequent to the 1988 radiocarbon date, which claimed the result was that the shroud was a medieval forgery because the dates were 1260 to 1390 AD. Later on, some lay persons took a closer look at the sample area that was taken from the Shroud of Turin in 1988 and found that it was different. It was anomalous from the rest of the linen. And subsequent research done by Ray Rogers proved that it was taken from a repaired section of the cloth that had been known to have been repaired in 1532 after a fire which almost destroyed the shroud. There were some nuns who were commissioned to repair the Shroud of Turin, and I went into this in more depth in the Shroud talk. But Ray Rogers then undertook to examine those samples, and he found that actually that repaired section, where they took the radiocarbon date from, was from cotton, which had been dyed to look the same color as the shroud and had been woven into the edge of the linen in that area. So Ray Rogers published evidence in the early 2000s, which showed that the sample taken from 1988 was not legitimate. They did a bad job of sampling, and that the medieval date they found should be tossed aside as not legitimate. And there was other evidence that was anomalous cloth. It actually weighed a different weight than the average weight of the linen itself. We talked about that before. So Ray Rogers also undertook microscopic polarized light microscopy analysis of the Sudarium. And this is some of what he wrote about before his death in an article he published on the Sudarium. So what you're looking at here are flax fibers on the upper slide here from 2000 BC. And it looks different from flax fibers from much later medieval times. So what you have over time is the deterioration or degradation of the flax fibers. This is a natural fiber, of course, and it undergoes microbial deterioration and also from light, from various light rays, and it leads to this appearance here that looks darker and more multicolored. So what you're looking at here by comparison are, let me get back on here to the last part of that. This is on the lower right is a fiber from the Shroud of Turin. Now Ray Rogers, according to his calculations, and he used something that hadn't been used before to determine the age of the cloth that he derived because he worked at a lab in New Mexico, which dealt with the safety of high explosives and such. So over time, explosives become unstable, and so they become dangerous. And so he used the same kind of calculation for the degradation of the linen itself. And in particular, there's a substance in the lignin of the linen called vanillin. And this degrades and disappears then eventually over time. And his estimate to the age of the Shroud of Turin was that it was between 1,300 and 3,000 years old. And when he looked at the same sort of fibers from the Sudarium, and what we have over here on the left side are, and he references this middle one in particular, compared to the Shroud of Turin, and they look very, very similar. So his conclusion was, in his article about the Sudarium, is that the absence of vanillin is similar to linen wrappings on the Dead Sea Scrolls and other ancient linens. It suggests a date between 1,300 and 3,000 years old, the Shroud of Turin. Now we draw that, extrapolate that out to the Sudarium. He says the Sudarium shows all of the physical and chemical properties of very old linen. I conclude that there is a finite possibility that the Sudarium is related in time and location to the Shroud. So with that, I believe we're finished. So that's a wrap up of, there hasn't been nearly as much scientific work done on the Sudarium as there has been on the Shroud, but it's slowly catching up. Now, obviously, it's not nearly as famous and nearly as dramatic, and actually doesn't have as many different aspects that can be tested or subjected to scientific analysis as the Shroud. But it is increasingly becoming focused upon. And some people believe that they actually, because of the correspondences that I mentioned, that they actually sort of corroborate one another. Now, one question you might ask, which one of the questions I initially asked was, what about doing a good radiocarbon date, which we still lack, of course, with the Shroud, and we're waiting for them to do a new C14 date, which would hopefully establish its antiquity back to 2,000 years old. They still haven't done it on the Shroud of Turin. Why? Only the Vatican knows, because it's now the property of the Pope, even though it's still kept in Turin, Italy. Have they done any C14 dates on the Sudarium? Well, they did, but it came out as not, it contained all kinds of different contamination, and the test was not rigorously performed. And so no one really holds to it having been tested legitimately for radiocarbon date. But obviously then that begs the question, it needs to be done for the Sudarium too, for those of us who want scientific proof and evidence for what it actually could be potentially. So we await that. Another question that has arisen is the DNA. Could you take DNA samples and compare them from one to the other, from the blood samples? Now, according to the scientists who have looked at the blood, both Ray Rogers and others, their belief is that the DNA is too degraded on both objects to do a good DNA test. Now, maybe future developments in DNA testing could perhaps get some legitimate DNA analysis, but at the present time, in the present state of this technique, it's not possible to do specific DNA testing. But as I said before, it has a common blood type of AB, so that's kind of interesting. So to summarize then, we have an object which has a better record of history than the Shroud does, because remember the shroud, we have that discontinuity in the medieval period where you have to make that connection to the image of Edessa in order to take it all the way back to the 1st century. But in the case of the Sudarium of Oviedo, we have a good solid evidence that it goes back to the 7th century. Remember the invasion of the Persians in 614, that we know that it came, and there's good record of that as having occurred going back to the 7th century. So that's interesting, and it has a more in some ways, a more solid historical foundation than the shroud itself. So with that, I will say the end. This happens to be a mosaic of Jesus from the city of Urfa, or Edessa. It's known as Urfa today, the ancient city of Edessa, where the image of Edessa was kept, possibly the Shroud of Turin. And I showed this during the Shroud of Turin talk as well. This is a mosaic, an ancient one from the 6th century, which is really fascinating, and shows what appears to be the face of Jesus modeled after the Shroud of Turin image from the city of Urfa itself. So with that, I will say the end.
Wow. Well, thank you, Brian, so very, very much. We're going to be posting this to various sites like YouTube and Facebook. If you have questions that you want answered, or you just want some clarity, leave them in the comments and on posts on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. We will do our best to answer them as quickly as possible. There'll also be some resources in the descriptions and contact information for the church, so we can connect with you and answer questions that you may have on the Sudarium of Oviedo. For now, I want to thank Dr. Brian Janeway for being here with me today and educating me. This has been great. Thank you.
My pleasure, of course. Thank you.
All right. Be well.
Thank you.